Thank you for the interesting talk. Mary had a little lamb, and you can derive a lot of translations from that. For the more interesting questions, we're talking about Islam and authenticity, and it's close to legitimacy.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the different sectarian landscapes. There are a lot of Muslims who are wondering what is true Islam, and is there a goal in itself to actually discover it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a Muslim, of course, it's an important question. We cannot really, I mean, if you are a dedicated Muslim, of course, then what is true Islam is an important question. I, for one, believe that the best and the most authentic source for us to understand what is Islam is the Quran. Over history, we had a shift from what I would call, a theonomic Islam, an Islam which is really based upon certain values which are entrenched in your being, towards an Islam which is overly legalistic, which means an Islam which is obsessed with rules. Today, when we talk about Islam, it seems to me that the words Islam, Sharia, and Fiqh is the same. When we say Islam says, we're actually saying Fiqh says. When we say we want to implement Islam, we actually mean we want to implement Fiqh.
Could you explain fiqh?
Well, Fiqh is actually a methodology for coming up with rules. It's actually an excellent methodology if you think about it. And if you study it deeply, it's actually a pretty good methodology. But again, it's really about extracting rules. Now, interestingly, the Quran does not have a lot of rules. I mean, this is something that might be shocking to people, even Muslims, when we say that the Quran has over 6,300 verses. How many verses do you think are rule bearing, or it has ahkam? It's people who went all the way up, they went to 400 verses, but the consensus is something around 120 verses. So when you're saying about 120 verses out of 6,300 verses, that's less than 3%, less than 4%. So in fact, less than 4% of the Quran's verses have rules, but we have a contemporary religious understanding which is obsessed with rules. I remember there was this saying which is attributed to Sufyan al-Thawri, who was again one of the Salaf. And I'm not sure how authentic this is, but it's attributed to him that he said something like, if it is possible for me to not even scratch my head except with a rule, with an actual athar or a hadith, then I would not do it unless there is a hadith. There is this obsession with, we have to follow rules.
But are there no values, you say, in Islam then?
No, of course, I'm not saying that it's devoid of values, but what I'm saying is that we don't really see them because we go on looking for rules. You actually, in the end, you find what you're looking for. And we have constructed this beautiful methodology, fiqh, which is really about extracting rules. And I think we really need to, that's one thing that we really need to work on, which is we need a methodology to go into the Quran and look for values. I think that there are methodologies like, for example, Maqasid al-Sharia, which is actually a different. It's normally taught as part of fiqh, but I think it's actually something different from fiqh. We have methodologies such as Ghayat al-Quran, or if you actually look at the Quran and you look at certain verses that tell you what is the intention of the Quran, or what is the intention of the different things promoted by the Quran, then you can actually construct something which is actually value based. But I really hope that this whole discussion that we're having, this whole, let me call it destruction that we're seeing as a result of ISIS, is really going to make us move into that direction of looking more into our values rather than more and more and more rules.
But you're not the first one who's saying that. There must be a lot of people who through history have said that we need to look beyond the rule-based way of believing things. What has hindered them?
Well, I guess we'll have to kind of start with a historical discussion about how we ended up with a legalistic religion. Interestingly, the best parallel that we can look at is not Christianity but Judaism. Judaism was actually seen as a very legalistic tradition. It was seen as unreformable. In fact, something that many people don't know, but the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, he had some very harsh words to say about Judaism because he considered Judaism cannot be integrated and overly legalistic and cannot be reformed.
Well, he was European.
He was European. But interestingly, I mean, the interesting point, to me at least, is going to the arguments at that time, and you see the arguments for and back and forth, and you can actually find Jewish philosophers at the time who were promoting talking on both sides of the argument, and you can compare it to our discussions today, and you can find very, very interesting parallels. But going back to your question about when did this all start, well, the methodology of fiqh was really put in rules. I mean, basically the methodology itself was the personality that is most attributed to is Al-Shafi'i. Al-Shafi'i lived in the 2nd century Hijri. And Al-Shafi'i was one of those individuals who, in the year 132 Hijri, a very important event happened, which is the fall of the Umayyad dynasty. After the fall of the Umayyad dynasty, you had the Abbasid dynasty. Of course, it was a period of turmoil and a lot of violence, but at the same time, the new regime, the Abbasid regime, was looking for religious legitimacy, and it was basically challenged by what we call al-Alawiyin. Alawiyin, I don't mean the Alawiyin today's Alavis or Alawis, but I mean basically the people who were descendants of Ali bin Abi Talib. And the Abbasiyin were basically descended from Al-Abbas, who was like the Prophet's uncle. So you had this situation where they were competing for religious legitimacy, and they both had their own claim. And the Abbasiyin were, they're the ones who won eventually, and they wanted to very clearly say that we have religious legitimacy. So in order for them to create to have a good claim to this legitimacy, they had to do a lot of things. One of the things, for example, was funding the work of Imam Malik, funding the work of Ibn Hisham, for example. They tried to recruit Ibn Hanifa. Abu Hanifa refused. There was this attempt by them to create an official Islam. Imam Malik, for example, they funded his work, but they wanted to go further. They wanted to take his book, the Al-Umm, and make it official Islam and denounce any other versions. And Imam Malik refused, and he was basically tortured by them for refusing. Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, they were looking for someone who had a lot of religious legitimacy to install as the grand judge. Because once they install it as a grand judge, they can say, you know what, this really, really amazing religious person, he's employed by us, and we get that legitimacy from him. He refused. He refused throughout his life until he died, and it was his disciple Abu Yusuf who actually agreed eventually. So when we look at that, in order for them to actually have a theocracy, you need a religious code of laws, and that code of laws will eventually, derive from fiqh.
Is that what we today call Sharia, or is it just a methodology for deriving rules?
This is a good question, because if you go to the Quran, Sharia really is never used in the word al-Sharia. It's always Sharia. It's not al-Sharia. When you say al-Sharia, it means the Sharia. Sharia really, if you look at the word, the meaning of the Arabic word, it means the pathway to water. But it's an analogy over here, because it's actually the pathway to God, the pathway to what God wants, what God would want you to act as, or what God would want you to do. In other words, what is moral behavior? So this is something that actually concerns all of us. Historically, we had fiqh as the only methodology for discovering Sharia. In other words, fiqh is a way for us to discover Sharia. Some religious scholars, for example, the Hanafis, historically have said that the actual Sharia is not discoverable. So you can always get close to the meaning. You can always get close to the answer, but you can never actually find the answer. You can only get close to it. Unfortunately, not all Islamic schools of thought were this humble. But today we have this. We understand Sharia as meaning fiqh, as fiqh being basically the doorway to Sharia. And I think that's not essential in nature. I think we can talk, for example, about maqasid al-Sharia as another methodology. Even though traditional scholars today do not legislate on the basis of maqasid al-Sharia, they can use maqasid al-Sharia to say this is the reason why this is allowed or not allowed, but they cannot independently legislate from it.
You were talking about the Abbasid dynasty and Umayyads and talking about the legitimacy. Today too, we have a lot of regimes that try to justify their existence by allying certain classes of priests, imams, things like that. So things has not changed, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, it was really during the Abbasid era that eventually the scholars, and we're talking really about Abu Yusuf, was the scholar, the disciple of Abu Hanifa, who decided to take that position of grand judge. Of course, during the Umayyad era, you actually had grand judges, but they were not really, they always were tainted with this association because the Umayyads were not as careful to project this kind of religious legitimacy as the Abbasids. So from that moment onwards, and I think maybe we can actually point to the Seljuk Empire when they actually, Nizam al-Mulk, for example, created this institution of teaching schools and decided that this is going to be the official scholarship, and this is going, basically standardized, did a lot of standardization. But eventually what happened is that we had an actual religious establishment. I mean, if you actually look at the Quran is actually anti-clerical. The Quran does not really trust clerics. But on the other hand, we ended up having a clerical establishment. That establishment was in charge of, first of all, it was independent. In other words, it was financially independent because they had a lot of waqfs and they had their own sources of funding. But also it ran the courts. So it created the law. It had two inputs. It had the input from, of course, the social context around it. It had input from the religious text, and it has input from the ruler. So, the ruler actually had some say, basically in siyasa, what we call siyasa, or political decisions. This changed in around the turn, you can say around the 19th or 20th century, because what happened is with the rise of the new modern state, the sources of funding for a lot of these institutions was cut, because you had an expansive kind of welfare state run independently by society, which is the waqf system, the endowments, basically, charitable endowments or trusts.
So these foundations were run by the clerical institutions.
It was not exactly run by them, but it was funding them. It was funding them. It was funding a lot of other things as well, but it was funding. One of the things it was funding was the religious establishment.
It's a great parallel to Norway because our National Muslim Union recently got cut off from the official grants from the state.
Okay, I didn't hear about that. But historically, what happened is that once the funding was cut, and the funding was cut basically because the political establishment at the time said we need to bring everything under the national control, and when this happened, the clerical establishment clerical establishment had a lot of power because it was independent and it had a lot of social legitimacy. After that, what we saw was a kind of control by the states of the religious establishment. The religious establishment, which used to be there used to be this system of checks and balances between the religious establishment and the political establishment. So, and for this reason, the political establishment always had limits. It could not go beyond. It was not perfect, but it was better than absolute rule. Unfortunately, with the rise of the modern state in a lot of these, in Middle Eastern countries, we had a reversal where we had complete control over society and over the religious establishment by the state.
We are into the topic where you have written about the paradigm shift, the historic one, the last couple of centuries. Could you elaborate?
Well, this is the paradigm shift, basically. It was shifting to a world dominated by nation states. In many ways, many things that you read historically, you kind of understand when you know that the state system, the legal system the political establishment did not really have a lot of direct control beyond the cities. For example, if you catch someone and you want to punish him, it is much more efficient to cut off a body part than to try to hold on to him when he can easily run, he can always flee to another area of the world, etc. It was a time without borders. With the rise of the nation state, we had certain developments, some very important developments. For example, really big strides in education, really big strides in self-determination.
Anti-slavery.
Exactly. So we had a lot of reforms, but at the same time, a lot of these, in certain parts of the world, it was forced. It was not native, and the result has not been exactly a smooth transition.
With that paradigm shift, you're also talking about a new or current paradigm shift. What is that?
I think we're really transcending the nation state right now. Our world is no longer dominated by this idea that nation equals geography equals ethnicity. We're here in Norway, and we automatically understand that you can be an ethnic Norwegian, but you can also be a non-ethnic Norwegian. You're still equals in front of the law. You're still Norwegian. So this idea of homogeneity, where the ethno-state is really no more, and we can see that the ethno-state is kicking back. With all the populism in the world today, it's actually the ethno-state trying to kick back and trying to reassert itself. Hopefully, unsuccessfully. But this is the kind of paradigm shift. We're actually looking at a period of integration, where the world becomes a lot more flat, which means that a lot of vertical control goes away. What happens when every Muslim kind of decides for himself what his practice is, because nobody is there to impose anything on him?
But isn't that what a lot of Muslims are afraid of, that their religion will be fragmented?
Yes, many Muslims feel that the loss of orthodoxy or the loss of those mechanisms are going to mean the end of Islam. I don't believe that it is true. It is true. And this is the important question that I'm trying to explore. What happens when you have no vertical control? What happens when you have this kind of situation where people can decide for themselves what is their practice or isn't? In a way, many places in the world are like that. We are in a country, for example, where nobody imposes upon you what to believe. What happens then? What kind of diversity, what kind of beauty comes out of it?
But then you have the argument that you're not here to please each other. There's a higher truth, and in comes ISIS and groups like them before them.
And this takes us back to the discussion on values. I think the one thing that really unites us very easily is values. Whenever we speak about rules, I think I once tweeted about this, which is really, really interesting. The fact that when we say good, moral good, in our head, I don't know if you're aware, but neurologically, the brain processes it in 3 different ways.
No, I'm not a neurosurgeon.
So when you say something is good, morally good, you can either mean it is disgusting versus pleasing or seemly. We're talking good versus bad. So one is disgust, one is compassion, and one is honesty. And apparently different parts of our brain actually process it. So basically our brain actually processes these are three different things. So you can actually talk about, there can be an action which is disgusting but not honest, not dishonest, but not cruel. And you can actually have an action, I mean, there are some examples that I can give, but they're also disgusting, so I don't want to but for example, let's say you're working in a bank and you skim a little bit of money. It is dishonest, but it's not disgusting, and it's not cruel, because nobody's really getting hurt. But we say this is bad. It's morally bad. Similarly speaking, maybe I can walk up to someone I dislike and I can just shoot them, and I can say, I don't like you. It's honest, and it's not exactly disgusting. Maybe it's disgusting in a physical, in a moral sense, but it's cruel, and we say that's morally bad. Right? Interestingly, if you talk about the good being basically those three different things, compassion is very universal. The expression of compassion, like for example, how we express ourselves in different languages, different cultures might be different. Maybe in some countries I will hug you, in some countries I want to keep my distance, but I like you anyway. But the feeling itself, compassion itself, is very universal, right? Honesty is probably the most universal. The definition of truth, the definition of honesty, again, is very universal. So if we actually try to decide that our morality is based upon honesty, we're not going to disagree a lot. If we decide that it's based upon compassion, again, we're not going to disagree a lot. However, if we're going to say that it's really about disgust versus seemliness, it's very cultural. What is disgusting in one culture might not be disgusting in another culture. The interesting thing here, which is I find very interesting, is that how many Muslims today will lie, but they will not eat pork?
Well, I think
why are we hung up on the disgust part? Why? Because it is cultural. Because we want to say we're unique. And because we want to, lord it over other people to say, we are the right, we have the right interpretation. And if you actually go back to the Quran, you see it's not that emphasized. The Quran, what's the worst thing ever? What's the worst word ever used in the Quran when describing people? It's kafir. Kafir actually does not mean non-believer. It means denier of truth. It means facts denial, and we can see a lot of facts denial right now in the world, which actually, brings us back to why this is important. However, it seems that we really, our contemporary religious understanding is really hung up in questions of seemliness versus disgust, rather than very universal, values.
We had recently debates on values in Norway in the election. Amongst other things, the brown cheese came up as a Norwegian value. That defines us, apparently. What can define Muslims' values while at the same time being inclusive of what you're talking about, that what unites us?
Yeah, I mean, again, when we go to the Quran, we find that the Quran makes a claim to be universal. The Quran itself claims that Islam is a universal religion, which is, again, it's mentioned in the text, but also it's mentioned extra-textually, basically that the Prophet is the last prophet, and he's the prophet to all mankind, not only to Arabs, for example. Which is why, for example, I kind of get annoyed when I see that people dress like Arabs in order to feel religious. I really get annoyed with it, because I feel this takes away something from Islam. It takes away something from the simplicity of Islam, from the essence of Islam. But yeah, I mean, basically, if we shift the discussion to values, I think we're going to disagree a lot less.
Okay, but the thing is, it seems like the Muslim community or communities, they are really more religious than the other identities they have. And it seems like there's a struggle when it comes to meeting the modern, not even the nation state, but modern institutions of democracy and kind of a religious neutral state that can emphasize equality. Is there a problem among Muslims, and is there truth to it that they cannot change, or they cannot fit into this new world?
I think me and you are kind of proof that we can.
Are we?
Yeah. In a way, I think it's important for us to talk very honestly about our problems. But I think we should not also be distracted from the fact that most of us are comfortable in our skin. The fact that the extremists stand out is mainly because they stand against this backdrop. Some people really do have a problem. They have a problem with modernity. They have a problem with feeling comfortable in their own identity. Uh, when someone projects his identity outwards, it means he has an identity crisis. There's a deficit. When someone goes out, I mean, when you feel, I'll tell you an experience I had, for example, here in Norway when I first came. It was March 2015. So I lived my entire life in the United Arab Emirates, and over there we're kind of comfortable in the fact that we're Muslims. So if the time of prayer comes, I simply excuse myself. I go into the prayer room and I pray. It's almost routine. It's not something which I don't exactly do it to send a message. I don't do it in order to project my, or what do you say, assert my identity. I simply do it because it's something that I do as a Muslim. So I went to this Salafi conference here in Oslo, and I've never. It was March, so it was still cold, but I've never seen as many people wearing jalabiyas or dishbashas in cold weather. When it came time to praying, I stood and prayed, and it was just again routine. But I felt that the people who were praying with me, they were almost giggling with excitement. That I am expressing my identity in this really cool way by praying, in public. And this to me does not seem like pride. It does not seem like pride. It seems like an identity deficit. And really, we really need to. If we want to really work on this, we really need to work on plugging that identity deficit.
So you say that being a minority, you strengthen this identity.
I think part of it is really reading your history, knowing exactly where you come from. Reading history can heal a lot of wounds. You understand that your people are not unique; they didn't really crash from the moon or something. You understand that human history is really like the same stories repeat across different ethnicities. We're as awesome and as awful as any other people.
The thing is, there is a crisis when it comes to identity. And a lot of people, even being born in Europe, some of them have actually accepted the message of ISIS and even traveled and fought for them.
Yeah.
You have mentioned earlier that ISIS is not a new phenomenon. And it might seem like it's a backtrack or a reaction to modernity. But what makes one who is actually not historically from that part of the world to make that journey and become part of that identity? I mean, we can't find any other examples right now of these things.
Well, I would slightly disagree when you say that ISIS is not new. I think ISIS is very modern. In many ways, especially like if you look at their aesthetics, for example, they're very modern. The concept itself, a lot of their concepts is rather modern. The nihilism, this extreme violence, for example. Again, I'm not saying the violence is new. The violence already existed, and in fact, when I go through Islamic history, I actually did this project where I wanted to read. When you look at Al-Dhahabi or Ibn Kathir, for example, the volumes of Islamic history is kind of like 35 volumes, and one of the projects I tried to do was read all through it. Now, I didn't manage to, because I was jailed and expelled before I managed to get through it.
Terrible problems.
But interestingly, there were times when I felt like I really want to hide out of shame when I read the amount of gratuitous violence that happened in Islamic history. And there are parts that made me almost sing and almost gloat with pride to say that, this is so beautiful, this is so humanistic, this is so great. And you know what? If the human race is wiped out and we have to speak the history of the human race, it's going to also be the same. Some chapters of the human history is really ugly, and some chapters are really beautiful. So sorry, I forgot the question.
Well, we were talking about these identity crises.
Yes, and ISIS.
Yes.
And, so yeah, I don't agree completely when you say that ISIS is not new. I think they're trying to claim legitimacy by saying that we're kind of a continuation of something, and unfortunately they are a continuation of certain trends, certain strands in Islam. That those strands were always fringe, they were always minority, and for certain reasons, they became almost mainstream.
But they have answers. I mean, what do the other ones have? They for a
exactly
frustrated young man or a woman, they have answers. And
they have answers for people at a time when nobody has an answer. When nobody seems to have an answer, they seem to have answers, and this is why they're attractive to a lot of people. And they're preying, they're almost like a virus in the sense that they prey really on a lot of different structural difficulties or structural problems and unanswered questions. I like the expression that we're not really seeing a radicalization of Islam, but an Islamization of radicalism, in a sense that these people who get attracted to this kind of stuff are already kind of radicalized. It's not that they read the Quran and they flip out. It's that they kind of already decided what they want to do at a certain level. And I'm saying this as someone who was radicalized. I mean, I used to be, at some point in my life, I used to ascribe to Salafi jihadism. And it took years for me to, slowly de-radicalize. One thing is that you can never really judge your own life on your own choices objectively. You're always looking, you're always, you're always biased in the way that you actually judge yourself. So you cannot go to someone who is radicalized and say, what is your motivation? He's not going to tell you, oh, I have an identity crisis and that's why I joined ISIS. He's going to say that I'm doing this for God and I'm doing this for country and I'm doing this to right the wrongs in the world, etc. So you cannot really rely upon this kind of self-assessment. But in a time when the traditional religious establishment is dominated by states and does not have a lot of legitimacy, in a sense that there's definitely a legitimacy crisis, because many young Muslims look at the amount of injustice that happens in the Muslim world and they say, you scholars are silent. You did not say anything. You're just sitting there, basically just rubber stamping whatever this tyrant says. And of course, this really affects their legitimacy.
So it starts as a call for rights, and for some it ends up either being really ISIS member or even leaving the faith.
Well, honestly, it is. You must be aware of the recent book Two Sisters. It's a story basically of two Somali sisters Somali Norwegian sisters who joined ISIS, and in fact we're just discussing what is their probable fate. Interestingly, they joined ISIS, and their younger brother became an atheist. And this is really, this is the contrast that you see. You have people looking for answers in different directions, because again we have a crisis. I think that the real crisis here is that we think that there are definite answers. I really think that this is one of the main problems.
That's not a good answer, Iyad.
Whenever you think that the answer is crisp and known and static and unchanging, you're going to be tricked somehow or the other. I think that the main way to really, really de-radicalize someone is to really make them love questions.
To think.
To be comfortable with incomplete and uncertain knowledge.
I have two unrelated questions, and we will continue for 15 more minutes, have a break, and question and answer session with you. I would like to talk about the Nahda period, early 1800s, with the Napoleonic wars. And there was a man called Kawakabi.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about him?
Well, Kawakabi lived in the late 20th century. He died in 1902, I believe. The Nahda area is a period of intellectual renaissance in the Arab world that approximately, you can discuss when it started, when it ended, but we're normally talking about between let's say 1882, or maybe even before that. Let's say the mid 19th century till around the 1930s.
Let's say I'm right, and then you can continue.
The event, you're right in the sense that the Napoleonic War, that Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. And this was really a part of the wars between, it was basically part of Napoleonic War. Basically, it was France versus the United Kingdom. At the time, Egypt was ruled in the same way, in the same historical continuity, since the Mamluks defeated the Mongols in the in the what do you say? What was it?
15th century, perhaps.
15th century, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for people in Egypt, and Egypt was a big country, for people in Egypt, this was the world. When the Napoleonic armies were able to basically destroy Egypt's army twice in a period of a few months, it was a huge shock. It was a huge shock not only to Egypt but to the entire region. As you know, the region at the time was very integrated, so there were no borders. People were basically passing through Egypt all the time. So what happens in Egypt doesn't stay in Egypt. So it was a huge shock for people to suddenly see how backward they are. And this kicked off a period of intellectual renaissance, because I'm skipping over a lot of events over here, of course. But it eventually kicked off a period of intellectual renaissance where people, the Levant or the Middle East in general, was grappling with this question. How did we go so far behind? How did we fall so far behind? And there were so many different ways, there were so many, answers, or so many attempts at answers. Some people said, oh, it's because of the West. Some people said, oh, it's because of religion. We have to get rid of religion. Some people said, oh, it's because of, there's a lack of education. Some people said, we have to modernize the army, etc. Kawakibi stands out as that guy who said, singly, we are backward because of a lack of liberty. And he wrote a book called The Nature of Tyranny, which is a masterpiece, I believe. In Arabic, it's called Taba' al-Istibdad, The Nature of Tyranny, which is, again, beautiful in Arabic, but also a very powerful polemic against tyranny and arguing for liberty. And I think this was a very strong inspiration for me, even though he lived over a century ago. But I felt that a lot of the stuff he was saying is surprisingly relevant for our state today.
Even today, and that was said over a century ago.
Yes.
Another thing, you mentioned the Abbasid era, the eruption of clergy. We also hear histories of a so-called Islamic Golden Age. On one side, you mention a state that controls and uses religion to control people or stay in power. On the other side, they had the freedoms and the arenas to create a renaissance, let's say it, for their age. So when some Muslims today look back, they try to see the structures back then and say that that might be the answer. What can you say about that?
Well, a little bit of... it is interesting. It's definitely an interesting question, because we look at that and we say, maybe that's what we need. What we need is to kind of recreate those structures. Interestingly, whenever we look at political history, which is the history of how different kings and different states and different military commanders interacted with each other, of course, always very violently, it's not pretty. It's always violent and it's always ugly. But that gives you a very one-sided view of history, because there's also the history of poets and history of doctors, physicians, history of art, and history of the people's history, the history of science and maths and chemistry, etc. And these things actually coexisted. They happened around the same time. The Abbasid era, because the Abbasids managed to create a peace. In other words, they managed to impose their hegemony in a way that made sure that there is some kind of political stability. That led to a flowering of, and of course they were very rich. You tend to become rich when you plunder a lot of money from all over the world. But interestingly, they sponsored a lot of interest. They sponsored a lot of work when it comes to science and when it comes to philosophy. Keep in mind that at the time the sciences were not really separated. So you had polymaths. So you had someone who studied physics and philosophy. He was a philosopher who also studied physics and chemistry and maths, etc. This is really interesting, but after the Mongols invaded Baghdad, and this was the kind of a dark period of history, they destroyed the libraries. So there was a lot of knowledge that was actually destroyed in that episode. We have a book called Al-Fahrast. Al-Fahrast in Arabic means the index. It's a word that is borrowed from Persian. The index is actually, or Al-Fahrast is actually the name of over 200,000 titles. I'm not sure about exactly. I think around 200,000 titles of books that were extant at the time that the book was written. Most of these are lost. So we don't have the actual text, but we have the topic of the book. We have the kind of the index of the library, and the library is gone. But by studying that, we can see how many people were writing books on chemistry, and how many people were writing books on biology, etc., etc. And we can actually try to build a graph to say, if we plot Islamic history, at what point did we have the maximum number of empirical scientists working? Empirical meaning, I'm not talking about people who did only philosophy or adab, literature, or poets. I'm talking about people who did maths, chemistry, physics, and the sciences. And we can actually see two peaks. One peak is in the early Abbasid era, around the era of Al-Ma'mun. And then we have around 100 years later, this is around, like, let's say, Al-Ma'mun, I forgot exactly the date, maybe like the mid second century, mid third century Hijri. So 200 and something Hijri. So yeah, around 8th century. And then you have around 100 years later, you have a drop, and then you have another bigger curve up there. And then from there, you have a slow decline till the modern era. So the Islamic golden age is definitely, it's not a myth. It was really a golden age, and it really left a mark. But we need to actually look at it in a more humanistic way. We have to actually think, yes, we made excellent contributions to world history. We wrote, and we did this because we borrowed a lot. We borrowed from Greeks. We borrowed from Hindu philosophers. We borrowed from Persian philosophers, etc. And we mushed it all up, and we created something really cool with it. And this is kind of how history progresses. This is how the whole human saga progresses. There is nothing essential about it.
There's not a correlation between the type of government back then.
No, I mean, and if you actually go through, I mean, for example, at the time, because you had charitable foundations and because you had kings and queens. More kings than queens.
A lot of queens.
Funding a lot of different stuff. Funding the arts, funding scientists, etc. They had some degree of independence, and they basically wrote, and
they had liberty.
they had liberty, but also they had state apparatus. For example, if you look at the history of, let's say, Ibn Sina, Ibn Sina was a philosopher, but he was also a very important physician. In fact, his books were used as textbooks until relatively recently in history. He worked in state hospitals. In other words, the state, the ruler, had his own, created this beautiful big hospital, and he said, I want you to head it. And you have this interaction between these figures and a state which actually wanted to fund them in one way or the other.
I think we will say stop here and take a 5-minute break, and then I hope you guys have some questions. We also have some questions from Twitter, so we will also use them. All right? Thank you.